My next guest is Mark Taylor. Mark has been a professional percussionist for 25 years and has had the opportunity of performing with some of the UK's finest orchestras and theater companies. Finding his passion and voice through music gave Mark the desire to share this understanding through his drum and percussion teaching, which he provides in schools and in his private practice. Mark wanted to share the creative and inspiring learning he was witnessing in schools from his experience of delivering whole class music workshops around the country. This was the start of the Education on Fire podcast in December 2016. The podcast has now released over 350 episodes and has been downloaded in 147 countries. Simply put, Mark interviews educators from around the world so that he can enable you to support your children to live, learn, and grow to their fullest potential. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Oh, Dana, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to having such a wonderful conversation, and we all have our struggles. So yeah, it's always great to be able to sort of air those with everybody.
Well, we'll start off with that struggle that you had. Tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
So as you mentioned there, I was doing sort of whole class music workshops, and I was also then at the time working for a music hub, which is sort of kind of like I guess like a state situation where you are in America, going into schools and delivering workshops and also doing some sort of individual drum lessons and percussion. And I kind of felt like my hands were being tied in that kind of being in the trenches, because I wanted to get involved in that more and more. It's the first time I'd really sort of stepped into that teaching in that kind of way. I was doing it for sort of 2 or 3 days around my other professional career. And I wanted to give back because I had such a great experience when I was learning to play and being in school in that kind of sort of teenage kind of years. But what I found was that mainly because of the arts cuts, which I think is sort of globally these days, there was a lot of focus on maths and English. So there were lots of times when we couldn't teach. And then one day it was that kind of, I'm really sorry, but your room that you were teaching in last term has now become a canteen, a kind of a sort of a part of a staff room. And could you teach, these 3 children under the staircase? And I thought, with the greatest will in the world, that's going to be really difficult, both in terms of being able to be productive and also the noise situation, and just kind of gave me a real sense of where the school was in terms of what they were expecting from music, what they thought it was giving their children. And I just thought, actually, they are getting something out of it because I'm here. But I think for my sort of longevity in terms of being able to give back, then something's going to have to change. And so that was my sort of starting point for looking at different schools and different situations to be able to kind of make my version of education a little bit different.
Yeah. And, just kind of finding your way, I would say, in those challenges that many of us face when there isn't funding given to your particular area, right? I taught an elective as well when I taught French, and, there were cuts at some of the schools I worked at as well. But it's also, finding ways to teach those kids, like you said. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that you've been doing as a musician. You still play professionally. So what is something that you do kind of on a regular week's basis in terms of both teaching and playing professionally?
So teaching, I'm actually working in 3 schools currently, which kind of takes me two or 3 days a week, where I've got some sort of group coaching within that school. So we've got like a percussion ensemble that's able to sort of bring everyone together to do those concerts, and then individual drums and percussion. So some of my youngest ones are kind of sort of 6, 7 years old. So they start really quite sort of small in that sort of prep area, all the way through to 6th form here, which is kind of 17, 18 years old, where we're suddenly doing a large scale sort of percussion ensemble with lots of instruments and a whole kind of percussion suite from that point of view. So that's a really nice range in terms of sort of boys and girls, and also that age range in that sort of different sort of demographics, which I really enjoy, because I think it's sort of mixing all those things together, which is really good. Professionally, I'm freelance, so it really sort of goes sort of swings and roundabouts. One minute you're playing the Royal Albert Hall. I've done quite a lot of work with the English National Ballet there. They do some great ballet in the round in the Albert Hall, which is an amazing thing. And the Royal Shakespeare Company has always been a fantastic organisation to work for. So I get to do some of those amazing things. And then at the same time, you have these sort of one-off concerts, which might be slightly smaller venues, or in a church, there's lots of great concerts goes on with sort of choral societies where you're sort of mixing kind of the singing in the orchestras together. So yeah, sometimes it's very busy doing one thing. Sometimes it's kind of a real mixture of everything.
Yeah, and like you said, it's kind of the demand, right, throughout the year.
Yep.
Of course, the holidays, I'm sure you get more engagements. Maybe sometimes in the summer, right, when they have more concerts outdoors. So it's that ebb and flow, right? But you feel like it's now kind of gotten to the point where you have that good mix between the teaching and the performing, and then the podcasting.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, one of the things that we decided when we started having a family was that kind of our days of touring around the country, being in a different city each week, was something we weren't going to do. We'd be able to sort of be at home more, because the education, one of the things we're sort of quite keen on is that kind of community aspect, you know, whether it's parental, whether it's the schools, whether it's sort of people around you. So yeah, so I think now that mix of the teaching, the performing in those areas, like I say, the seasonal things are really sort of great example. You know, Christmas is usually always really busy, doing a Christmas show or whatever for a few weeks, and like I say, the summers are often busy with summer opera and that kind of thing. So yeah, that kind of ebb and flow is quite good, because you know you're going to be busy for one particular area, but you can then kind of make that difference when you know that like say the off season, as it were, certainly January, February is usually much quieter. But from a podcasting point of view, that's great, because it means I can schedule recordings and I can get to have all those conversations and fit those around as well. And the podcast really sort of came out of that idea of, like I said, going and doing those workshops. You'd sort of see those teachers who are really sort of despondent, because as we all know, we get into education to make a difference, and there's so many other factors which kind of stop us from doing that. And that was just an opportunity I felt, being in so many different environments. I could say, well, I understand your frustration here, but I know this school over here is doing some amazing things, or this charity is providing something in this particular school or this organization. So yeah, just wanted to be able to share that. And that was kind of that essence of coming out of the trenches, in terms of what I was able to do is kind of change my focus on what it was, rather than just being despondent about maybe, like I said, the cuts or the way that my sort of teaching was going. I could bring this spotlight to some of these really positive things that were happening, get to chat with lots of positive people who are bringing their energies to education in a different way. And I think it's probably that sort of performer in me which likes the podcasting and the chatting and the live streaming and that kind of thing, and that sort of took me there. So like I say, yeah, those three is a mix, is a really sort of happy place for me now.
So let's talk a little bit about the Education on Fire podcast. So when did you start it? How often do you broadcast, and what is the goal of the podcast?
So it started back in December 2016, which seems like a long time ago.
Yeah, pretty much.
And yeah, and like I said, the focus originally was just to sort of help that teacher in that staff room. But one of the things that started to develop as it got older and I got more experience was the fact that everyone was talking about, you know, being supportive for the child in the heart of it. So whether you were a teacher or a parent, or whether you were a fantastic author and you had something else to give in an educational sense. So it sort of broadened out a little bit to kind of speak to anybody who's able to help people support children to, as you said, to sort of live and grow and fulfill what they'd like to do. And I think being a musician, having that sort of passion for what I was really enjoying is something I like to be able to sort of spread. We release it once a week, which is great. The episodes are usually around sort of anywhere between sort of half an hour to an hour, depending on where we sort of go with this sort of conversational feel, as you can probably hear from the way that I like to chat and talk about those things. And then one of the things that I've just started doing is to be able to bring this idea of live streaming into it as well, because as you all know, it's fantastic having these conversations, and we have a great conversation, but people listening don't necessarily have that opportunity to kind of chime in. There might be something they're thinking they could just ask a question, or they'd like to sort of put a comment in as well. So the education on fire on YouTube, which I'm doing as sort of a live podcast or as a live stream, just enables me to kind of have these conversations. But people who want to comment, ask some Q&A, I can bring those comments on, and I can sort of be more of a mediator, as it were, between those things, and sort of bring a community together, and we can sort of have these sort of hangout kind of conversations as well. So that's sort of an exciting sort of new prospect. And I think, you know, as we're here sort of talking on video as well, it's sort of an opportunity for us to sort of spread into sort of that direction.
So when you started podcasting, did you get a lot of people reaching out who you'd met working at these different schools, or was it more word of mouth from, like you said, the staff lounge, how people kind of spread the word from those schools that you worked at?
Yeah, so to begin with, it was really reaching out to people either that I knew personally. So I think my first few episodes were a director of a school that I was working at, and some people that I've met at staff meetings, some that I've met at a conference. Some people were sort of friends of friends who sort of then heard, and then each time you release an episode, you've got more to sort of say, look, I'm already started, and that kind of thing. Obviously, the beginning's the hardest bit when you're sort of trying to sort of sell an idea rather than just actually what you've already managed to produce. And so yeah, and so then it just kind of started to grow, and then sort of the tables kind of shifted a little bit. It went from me trying to have to reach out and find people to people listening, and then finding out about it, and then approaching me and asking if they could be on the show. And so now it's sort of almost gone full circle, where there are people that I'd like to speak to, and I sort of, if I think it'd be a great conversation, I can reach out. But generally speaking, I've got quite a long list of people who are waiting for the next recording sessions to come in, which is a great situation to be in, because I can really then sort of focus on, we're covering a nice range of topics and getting a good sort of conversation for everyone listening.
And do you interview people from all walks of life, just educators, or just musicians?
So it's all walks of life. I mean, the music side is kind of my passion, but it's kind of, what that did is it brought out that idea that everyone has their own passion and their own focus and journey that they want to go on. So it's education at the center in terms of what we're doing as educators and people that are helping our children learn. So it can be a teacher specifically. So it might be, we're talking about dyslexia. It might be that it's a company that's bringing in the opportunity to learn about AI, or it might be a new platform that's doing it. It might be an author that was a teacher that was helping a child in a certain area, maybe about well-being, that's doing that. I speak to some people who have sort of well-being apps, or a part of an organization that are helping in that way. So if they're helping a child in any particular way, whether it's sort of internally from the education system, and often people who were in schools who've sort of broadened out into their passion and their focus, who are then sort of shining a light back into it to sort of help people that way, kind of really is sort of really where I sort of hit that sort of middle ground, I guess. So it's sort of everyone has got that kind of community feel for helping the child, whether it's your own child or whether it's someone that you're supporting in a school.
Yeah, and I think everybody has the kids' best interests in mind, right? Whether it comes to more exposure to music programs or building music programs in certain areas. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a few things that you've done before you started the podcast. So in the pre-chat, you mentioned to me a little bit about starting a music company. And also you got a spot on the National Council, and you're now the vice chair of it. So tell me kind of what these other, I would say, buckets of just music advocacy are that you work with.
Yeah, so the music education company was called Rhythmically Speaking, and that came out of a conversation I had. I was on tour, and I can't remember, I think we might have been in Dublin or somewhere like that, and the trumpet player was a friend of mine. And I just started working in the school that he was working in, and he'd sort of gone from teaching the trumpet in the school to becoming head of music, and was putting this whole program together. And he said, look, come along, do some rhythm workshops, do some teaching in our school. I'm building this sort of amazing community there, and we've got these got some great other musicians in there teaching as well. So I sort of started doing that, and then when we were sort of touring and playing together, we were sort of thinking about some of these things we'd set up in the school were working really well and really supporting children both within the music system but also outside of it as well. And we said, we're not really seeing that in other schools. Maybe we should set something up where we could offer it into different schools and go and do that. And that sort of became the essence of these sort of whole class rhythm workshops, which then turned into samba and African drumming. And we worked out a whole program that we could go and do in person, and then leave resource materials. We'd record it back at that time. It was on CDs, so we'd record it and then send the CDs round so the school could have a recording, and the parents could have a recording, and the people who had taken part. And it was a fantastic thing, and we did it for quite a long time. And then there was started to be a shift actually here, where some of these music hubs started doing the same sort of thing, because they were sort of realizing that actually, when it's cost efficient to sort of teach one or two people in a whole class, so you got one or two sort of musicians in a whole class rather than the one-to-one. And it's also really good for the children, because what they're able to do is you take away some of the fear factor, because you're doing things in a group. So for our samba workshops, for example, you might have had sort of 4 or 5 children doing a shaker, 4 or 5 doing a scraper, 4 or 5 on a little drum, 4 or 5 on a go-go bell type thing. And you put these really simple rhythms together, so they get the enjoyment and the understanding of what that music process is in terms of learning these things and bringing an ensemble together, but without saying, oh, and here you are, you've got to do this on your own, which we know can be a little bit daunting. But what we could do is we could bring those elements in and just build those individual things up. And there'll be someone who's really confident, said, I'd like to do the big drum, and I'd like to do this. And then more and more would do it. So if you go into the school more than once, we'd have a range of like a one-off session or a whole series of sessions. By the end of it, everyone just wants to do everything all the time, and building that confidence and everything was a really, really great thing. So that just grew, and we started in London, and then we moved and did them all over the UK, which was absolutely fantastic. And that kept going for quite a long time. And then my business partner left his school in London and moved away to Bangkok. So we decided that was probably, we could have kind of taken more people on and did it, but we really enjoyed sort of the hands-on version of it. So we thought it sort of come to a natural end, sort of from that sort of practical sense, but also, as I said, these music hubs were starting to take this idea into what they were doing as well. So they were doing a great job of being able to do that on their own. So it came to a natural sort of conclusion after about sort of 10 years or so. So that was a great thing to be able to do, in a real sense of being able to bring that sort of musical passion that I had directly into schools in that way. So that was, rhythmically speaking, that sort of education company, as it were. And as you mentioned, the vice chair situation, I mean, that's for the National Association for Primary Education here in the UK. And I was very honoured to be able to be part of that. And that was one of the schools that I was teaching in. The then director said to me, we have a spot on the National Council, and she said, you've been teaching here for a while. We know that you're sort of passionate about education and teaching and that kind of thing, but we're also really keen on that parental view as well, and also not just being a classroom teacher, but having that one-on-one music teacher idea of what it's like to be involved in education, but not just in the classroom. So they invited me along to a meeting, and there was a variety of topics that they were doing. And so I went along and had a great time, and they very kindly invited me to take part and to be part of the council. And then, so that's probably about 7 or 8 years ago now. So then I sort of gradually got more and more involved, to the point where, as she's quite rightly said, I'm vice chair, and been involved in their sort of virtual summits and various things that they've organised in the last few years.
So you told me a little bit in the pre-chat also about how the UK really allocates funding to music teachers. So it's quite different than in the US, that it's basically the music teachers are hired by the county, correct? And then the schools will ask for a certain amount of FTE, full-time equivalent, for the music program that they have. So how has this changed, I would say, since you were a student? And also, when you were a student, you told me things were free. Is it so free when people want to learn to play an instrument?
less free now. I think this is the same for everybody. When I was at school, so we're talking probably the mid-80s now. One of the things that we were asked to do as we were choosing our schools was, did we learn an instrument? And also that this particular school, for the first year, you had to learn an instrument. So the head of music from the new school came in and did various exercises. So had me sort of drumming away and blowing a raspberry into a mouthpiece and bowing a stringed instrument to sort of see what sort of thing worked for you. And I was allocated the idea of drumming. And at the time, I was thinking, I just want to play football all the time. I'm not really
Yeah.
interested in music. I've done singing and recorders at primary school, but not so bothered about anything else now. But because we had to do it, and then our music lessons were basically everyone coming together and forming a wind band,
Hmm.
much like sort of the American system, really, I absolutely loved it. And these lessons were absolutely free at that particular
Yeah.
time. And I enjoyed it so much. I had a great teacher who then offered me some private lessons at a really great rate. And I think the lessons in school were very heavily subsidized. So
Hmm.
it literally cost my parents just a few pounds for each term
Yeah.
just to kind of keep that momentum going. Of course, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because there were other people in the same situation, which meant the music got great in the school. So then the opportunities to perform got better. There were more people. The standard got higher. We started doing residential courses and went into the community doing lots of stuff, and it was absolutely amazing. But it was only the fact that we had to do it which kind of
Yeah.
gave me that exposure, which then became my career, which is kind of the amazing thing and why I think it's so important. Gave me a voice in a way that as a teenager I didn't quite have before, but sort of
Hmm.
having something in a musical sense, it kind of really worked for me. So sort of if you sort of fast forward into when I then started to do it, sort of probably in sort of the mid, maybe sort of 2014, 2015, something
Hmm.
like that. The way it started to had changed was the fact that the local educational authority would originally sort of run this sort of the music side of everything,
Hmm.
and then schools could just buy in, you know, a drum teacher, a violin teacher, and that kind of thing, and there'd be a sort of a music coordinator within a school that would then look after it, maybe do the choir, do the ensemble, but you get these specialists coming in,
Hmm.
and a lot of that was heavily subsidized. And then bit by bit the local authorities got less and less funding, and then what happened was these sort of music hub organizations that were part of the council then realized that they would just disappear, which is what was
Hmm.
happening around the
Hmm.
country. So they
Hmm.
basically formed like music trusts. They became their own entity, that was able to function on their own. So they sort of set themselves up in that particular way, and then the funding that they had could be sort of ring fenced and will be exactly it work in the same kind of way, but they had a little bit more control of their destiny. So
Hmm.
at that point, you have a lot of sort of contracted staff who are drum teachers, violin teachers, or doing music in schools, but they're employed by the trust, the sort of
Okay.
music hub, as it were. And then, like you say, the schools can then say, yes, I'd like a violin teacher for an hour a week, or I've got, you know, 6 pupils who'd like to learn the trumpet, and could someone come in and do a, you know, a day a week of singing, and they can do it in that way, and they can build it up in a way that
Hmm.
works for the school, and they can expand it in a way which really works for them. So then, depending on how excited a school is, whether it's a music teacher, whether it's a head teacher, or someone who's kind of really passionate about music, it can expand in whichever way they can, and in whichever way they can afford, because it still costs some money, and often those get passed on to the parents. But
Hmm.
there are various um, parts of funding these days, depending on your sort of social economic background, that kind of gives you some kind of free options as well, depending if you can be supported.
Hmm. So, if, let's say a musician starts a program, like a guitar program at a school, out of these hubs, do those musicians usually stay at the school for more than a year, or is there a lot of turnover?
No, they can stay there for a long
Mhm.
time. I think. I mean, if we're thinking that they might start from scratch, it might be that they go in and they do maybe say 6 weeks or so of everybody in a particular class learning guitar or
Mhm.
ukulele. They often start off here doing
Mhm.
that, so everyone gets a chance to play. And then normally off the back of that, they then say, right, we have the opportunity for this teacher to continue. If you'd like to have sort of individual small group lessons, we can organize that as well. So those particular people would then sign up, and then you sort of got a member of staff that's there, and of course you kind of get used to these relationships. So hopefully the
Mhm.
majority of those pupils that started would play for the rest of their sort of school career, as it were, during that particular school. And then each year you'd hopefully bring some from the younger years coming through as well. And then it just starts to grow because, you know, children see something amazing, they see the guitar group
Mhm.
playing a concert or get the chance to perform in assembly, and they go, I want to be part of that as well. And so it sort of naturally grows and becomes the sort of positive energy within the school which can then be celebrated. And that's kind of the nucleus of how these things start. And it takes a long time to get
Yeah.
going, but it's obviously really successful when it does. It's much quicker for it to be dismantled, which is why when there's a change of focus or a change of head or a change of policy within a school, It's can be a shame when that sort of disappears quite quickly.
Mhm, mhm. So, like I mentioned, it's really just getting the kids interested, when they're young, right? It's, exposing
Yep.
them to instruments. It's making sure, where you live, there's, interest, there's a community involvement. The kids find something they like doing, right? There's, where I live, there's a little bit of exposure in grade 4 to multiple instruments. They have it in music class, but also they have kids try out just different instruments so they can maybe be in the orchestra at the end of elementary school before they go to middle school. But it's really just making sure that there is the opportunity for those kids from that young age, right? Because just like languages, the younger you learn instruments, right, the better you'll get.
Absolutely. That's the and I think the other thing is it really is that sort of catching net, because it
Yeah.
might be that your parents are musical, in which case
Mhm,
they'll have the opportunity to give you private lessons or be part of an ensemble that can support you in that. In
mhm,
my particular situation, my parents weren't musical. So it was the school exposure and environment that gave me that. And I think that's the important thing, like say that sort of breadth of experience, whether it's languages, whether it's sport, whether it's music, whatever it happens to be,
mhm,
you from that you get a sense of this is something that's speaking to me in a way, and if I'm excited about it and I want to put the time and the effort in, have those relationships with the teachers that are involved, I think that just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of excitement in your learning and your growth as you're going through education. And I think that's a real great starting point.
mhm, mhm. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the YouTube live broadcasts. So you said we're recording now at the beginning of September, but you will be starting those around September 12th, correct?
Yeah, that's it. Once we sort of get into September, I just
Mm-hmm.
decided that the way to do it, because I'd sort of done live streams into my Facebook group and I've done live podcasts on YouTube, but sort of ad hoc when sort of
Mm-hmm.
people
Mm-hmm.
weren't able to record for the podcast audio only. I kind of made that available and enjoyed it more and more and more. And as we know, I think one of the successful things about podcasts is one, it's on demand, but the fact that you kind of know when the next one is coming out, so you kind of
Mm-hmm.
pitch your week and your sort of working commute maybe or whatever it is when you want to listen. And I thought actually having a regular spot on it's going to be on a Tuesday night
Mm-hmm.
about 7:30 here in the UK, and just where I'm going to be here, so I can talk a little bit about the podcast that's been released on the audio side of it earlier in the week.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about an older podcast that people may not have seen because, like I say, with 350 odd episodes, there are lots there that can get lost, or you might not come across. So bring some of those out of the archives in terms of sort of showing what they are, maybe some of the resources, and then people who want to come on and they're happy for it to be live streamed and take part in an interview in that same kind of way. But like I said, rather than me being the focus of everything in terms of bringing those questions in, people watching can ask questions in the chat, and I can bring that chat onto the screen and ask those questions for them, and we can kind of have a little bit of a to and fro and have more of that community experience. So yeah, that's the aim of that.
Okay, great, great. Well, I'll make sure I put the links in the show notes so people can access that and subscribe and see what you're talking about. And are you thinking of doing it kind of based on a theme, a monthly theme, or maybe a season of different ideas, or have you gotten that far in your planning?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm excited about is that from, like I said, having sort of batched the audio podcasts, we can be talking
Mm-hmm.
about something relevant today, but it might not go out for a couple of months or so,
Mm-hmm.
and so it then becomes less relevant. So one of the things I wanted to do is to kind of have this idea of maybe being able to talk this week about something that's been in the news recently. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, one of the big things here in the UK this week is the fact that there's problems with some of our schools in terms of some of the concrete construction, which has now caused some issues, and they're having to
Mm-hmm.
bring temporary classrooms in some schools aren't opening at the beginning of the school year. And so I could talk about that on the audio podcast, but you might not hear it for a little while. Whereas the
Mm-hmm.
the thing about being reactive would be fantastic. So I think being a little bit reactive to the here and now, answering some of those questions, sharing some of those thoughts, and then, like I said, been able to just sort of make sure people are aware of the podcast that's gone live that week, but also that bringing the sort of the archived ones in as well, especially if there's some great resources or some things that educators have been able to share that, you know, they've shared it once. I want to make sure that people who sort of come across Education on Fire since then still make sure that they get the opportunity to hear all that great information and share those resources too.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to get that community involvement, like you said, those bringing up something that's going on that people know about and like ideas that they might have or what they're doing to work around the problem. Well, it's
Yeah,
been
exactly. I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I think it's that sense of just sort of being a conduit, really. You know, I
Uh-huh.
sort of I like having that sort of ability just to be able to sort of connect people, bring out the things that they're passionate about, and yeah, just sort of if I can make that part of people watching live as well as being able to do that, like I say, for the here and now when we're just chatting, I think it should be an exciting thing to do. I think it's like I said, it's that performance element I quite liked from that musical background.
Well, it's been a great conversation today about your career and how you've worked in many schools, just helping kids learn instruments, working with percussion ensembles, both from the young age to kids that are about to go on to university. Out of everything we've talked about today, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I think the biggest thing for people to remember, and it's something that comes up quite a lot when I'm chatting to people, is you think it's the nitty gritty of what you're teaching children that makes the big difference, but so often I've just been told that actually it's the way that a student remembers a teacher making them feel,
Yeah.
or the fact they suddenly felt seen, they felt understood, taking the time to understand a little bit about them beyond the classroom. And I think just realizing that every little conversation that you have, every little bit of interest, every little connection you have gives that. And it's a real kind of starting point for a child to take a little bit of ownership of what they're able to do and how they can grow going forward. And I think while we might all like sort of a silver bullet wholesale change of education in some form or another, I think just knowing that every day you make a difference just by those meaningful comments, conversations, and connections, then I think each day then you're making a big difference.
Yeah, it's so important. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
So educationonfire.com is the website, and obviously all the podcasts are there. And then you can find me if you search for Education on Fire on your favorite podcast app. It should pop up there. Education on Fire on Facebook. That's the place where you can find my page, and you can also then find through there the private groups should you want to sort of connect more and give us the opportunity to sort of have more of a conversation in that sort of private forum.
Great. I'll make sure I put those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure having you on and talking music.
Oh, Donna, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to people from across the world. Keep up the great work. I just think people hearing these stories about their struggles, but also their passions and how they've worked through that, such an important message. So yeah, thanks very much indeed.